Welcome back to Dr. Finance. This is an article written by Arthur Lewis, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1979. This is his paper published in 1954. Let's go. Economic development with unlimited supplies of labor. This essay is written in the classical tradition, making the classical assumption and asking the classical question. The classics, from Smith to Marx, all assumed or argued that an unlimited supply of labor was available at subsistence wages. They then required how production grows through time. They found the answer in capital accumulation, which they explained in terms of their analysis of the distribution of income. Classical systems thus determined simultaneously income distribution and income growth with the relative prices of commodities and as a minor byproduct. Interest in prices and in income distribution survived into the neoclassical era, but labor ceased to be unlimited in supply, and the formal model of economic analysis was no longer expected to explain the expansion of the system through time. These changes of assumption and of interest served well enough in the European parts of the world, where labor was indeed limited in supply, and where for the next half century it looked as if economic expansion could indeed be assumed to be automatic. On the other hand, over the greater part of Asia, labor is unlimited in supply, and economic expansion certainly cannot be taken for granted. Asia's problems, however, attracted very few economists during the neoclassical era. Even the Asian economists themselves absorbed the assumptions and preoccupations of European economics, and hardly any progress has been made for nearly a century with the kind of economics which would throw light upon the problems of countries with surplus population. When Keynes' general theory appeared, it was thought at first that this was the book which would illuminate the problems of countries with surplus labor, since it assumed an unlimited supply of labor at the current price, and also in its final pages made a few remarks on secular economic expansion. Further reflection, however, revealed that Keynes' book assumed not only that labor is unlimited in supply, but also, and more fundamentally, that land and capital are unlimited in supply. More fundamentally, both in the short run sense, that once the monetary tap is turned, the real limit to expansion is not physical resources, but the limited supply of labor. And also in the long run sense, that secular expansion is embarrassed not by a shortage, but by a superfluity of saving. Given the Keynesian remedies, the neoclassical system comes into its own again. Hence, from the point of view of countries with surplus labor, Keynesianism is only a footnote to neoclassicism, albeit a long, important, and fascinating footnote. The student of such economies has therefore to work right back to the classical economics before he finds an analytical framework into which he can relatively fit his problems. The purpose of this essay is to thus see what can be made of the classical framework in solving problems of distribution, accumulation, and growth first in a closed and then in an open economy. It is not primarily an essay in the history of economic doctrine, and it will not therefore spend time on individual writers inquiring what they meant or assessing its validity or truth. Our purpose is rather to bring their framework up to date in the light of modern knowledge and to see how far it then helps us to understand the contemporary problems of large areas of the earth. The closed economy. We have to begin by elaborating the assumption of an unlimited supply of labor and by establishing that it is a useful assumption. We are not arguing, let it be repeated, that the assumption should be made for all areas of the world. It is obviously not true of the United Kingdom or of Northwest Europe. It is not true either of some of the countries usually now lumped together as underdeveloped. For example, there is an acute shortage of male labor in some parts of Africa and Latin America. On the other hand, it is obviously the relevant assumption for the economies of Egypt, of India, or of Jamaica. Our present task is not to supersede neoclassical economics, but merely to elaborate a different framework for those countries which the neoclassical and Keynesian assumptions do not fit. In the first place, an unlimited supply of labor may be set to exist in those countries where population is so large relative to capital and natural resource, that there are large sectors of economy where the marginal productivity of labor is negligible, zero, or even negative. Several writers have drawn attention to the existence of such disguised unemployment in the agricultural sector, demonstrating in each case that the family holding is so small that if some members of the family obtained other employment, the remaining members could cultivate the holding just as well. Of course, they would have to work harder. The argument includes the proposition that they would be willing to work harder in these circumstances. The phenomenon is not, however, by any means confined to the countryside. Another large sector to which it applies is the whole range of casual jobs. The workers on the docks, the young men who rush forward asking to carry your bag as you appear, the jobbing gardener, and the like. These occupations usually have a multiple of the number they need, each of them earning very small sums from occasional employment. Frequently, their number could have halved without reducing output in this sector. Petty retail trading is also exactly of this type. It is enormously expanded in overpopulated economies. Each trader makes only a few sales. Markets are crowded with stalls, and if the number of stalls were greatly reduced, the consumers would be no whit worse off. They might even be better off, since retail margins might fall. 20 years ago, one could not write these sentences without having to stop and explain why in these circumstances the casual laborers do not bid their earnings down to zero, or why the farmer's product is not similarly all eaten up in rent. But these propositions present no terrors to contemporary economists. A little more explanation has to be given of those cases where the workers are not self-employed but are working for wages, since it is harder to believe that employers will pay wages exceeding marginal productivity. The most important of these sectors is domestic service, which is usually even more inflated in overpopulated countries than is petty trading. In Barbados, 16% of the population is in domestic service. The reason is that in overpopulated countries, the code of ethical behavior so shapes itself that it becomes good form for each person to offer as much employment as he can. The line between employees and dependents is very thinly drawn. Social prestige requires people to have servants, and the grant senior may have to keep a whole army of retainers who are really little more than a burden upon his purse. This is found not only in domestic service, but in every sector of employment. Much businesses in underdeveloped countries employ a large number of messengers whose contribution is almost negligible. You see them sitting outside office doors or hanging around in the courtyard, and even in the severest slump in the agricultural or commercial employer is expected to keep his labor force somehow or other. It would be immoral to turn them out, for how would they eat in countries where the only form of unemployment assistance is the charity of relatives? So it comes about that even in the sectors where people are working for wages, and above all, the domestic sector, marginal productivity may be negligible or even zero. Whether marginal productivity is zero or negligible is not, however, of fundamental importance to our analysis. The price of labor in these economies is a wage at the subsistence level. We define this later. The supply of labor is therefore unlimited, so long as the supply of labor at this price exceeds the demand. In this situation, new industries can be created, or old industries expanded without limit at the existing wage. Or, to put it more exactly, shortage of labor is no limit to the creation of new sources of employment. If we cease to ask whether the marginal productivity of labor is negligible and ask instead only the question from what sectors would additional labor be available if new industries were created offering employment at subsistence wages, the answer becomes even more comprehensive. For we have then not only the farmers, the casuals, the petty traders, and the retainers, domestic and commercial, but we have also three other classes from which to choose. First of all, there are the wives and daughters of the household. The employment of women outside the household depends upon a great number of factors, religious and conventional, and is certainly not exclusively a matter of employment opportunities. There are, however, a number of countries where the current limit is for practical purposes only employment opportunities. This is true, for example, even inside the United Kingdom. The proportion of women gainfully employed in the UK varies enormously from the region to another according to employment opportunities for women. For example, in 1939, whereas there were 52 women gainfully employed for every 100 men in Lancashire, there were only 15 women gainfully employed for every 100 men in South Wales. Similarly, in the Gold Coast, although there is an acute shortage of male labor, any industry which offered good employment to women would be besieged with applications. The transfer of women's work from the household to commercial employment is one of the most notable features of economic development. It is not by any means all gain, but the gain is substantial because most of the things which women otherwise do in the household can in fact be done much better or more cheaply outside, thanks to the large-scale economies of specialization and also to the use of capital, grinding grain, fetching water from the river, making cloth, cooking the midday meal, teaching children, nursing the sick, etc. One of the surest ways of increasing the national income is therefore to create new sources of employment for women outside the home. The second source of labor for expanding industries is the increase in the population resulting from the excess of birth over deaths. This source is important in any dynamic analysis of how capital accumulation can occur and employment can increase without any increase in real wages. It was therefore a cornerstone of Ricardo's system. Strictly speaking, population increase is not relevant either to the classical analysis or to the analysis which follows in this article, unless it can be shown that the increase of population is caused by economic development and would not there otherwise be so large. The proof of this proposition was supplied to the classical economist by the Malthusian law of population. There is already an enormous literature of the genus. What Malthus really meant, into which we need not enter. Modern population theory has advanced a little by analyzing separately the effects of economic development upon the birth rate and the effects on the death rate. Of the former, we know little. There is no evidence that the birth rate ever rises with economic development. In Western Europe, it has fallen during the last 80 years. We are not quite sure why. We suspect that it was for reasons associated with development, and we hope that the same thing may happen in the rest of the world as development spreads. Of the death rate, we are more certain. It comes down with development from around 40 to around 12% in the first stage, because better communications and trade eliminate death from local famines. In the second stage, because better public health facilitates banish the great economic diseases of plague, smallpox, cholera, malaria, yellow fever, and eventually tuberculosis. And in the third stage, because widespread facilities for treating the sick snatch from the jaws of death many who would otherwise perish in infancy or in their prime. Because the effect of development on the death rate is so swift and certain, while its effect on the birth rate is unsure and retarded, we can say for certain that the immediate effect of economic development is to cause the population to grow. After some decades, it begins to grow, we hope, less rapidly. Hence, in any society where the death rate is around 40 per thousand, the effect of economic development will be to generate an increase in the supply of labor. Marx offered a third source of labor to add to the reserve army, namely the unemployment generated by increasing efficiency. Ricardo had admitted that the creation of machinery could reduce employment. Marx seized upon the argument and in effect generalized it. For into the pit of unemployment he threw not only those displaced by machinery, but also the self-employed and petty capitalists who could not compete with larger capitalists of increasing size, enjoying the benefit of the economies of scale. Nowadays, we reject this argument on empirical grounds. It is clear that the effect of capital accumulation in the past has been to reduce the size of the reserve army and not to increase it. So we have lost interest in arguments about what is theoretically possible. When we take account of all the sources we have now listed, the farmers, the casuals, the petty traders, the retainers, domestic and commercial, women in the household, and population growth, it is clear enough that there can be, in an overpopulated economy, an enormous expansion of new industries or new employment opportunities without any shortage of unskilled labor becoming apparent in the labor market. From the point of view of the effect of economic development on wages, the supply of labor is practically unlimited. This applies only to unskilled labor. There may at any time be a shortage of skilled workers of any grade, ranging from masons, electricians, welders, to engineers, biologists, or administrators. Skilled labor may be the bottleneck in expansion, just like capital or land. Skilled labor, however, is only what Marshall might have called a quasi-bottleneck if he had not had so nice a sense of elegant language. For it is only a very temporary bottleneck, in the sense that if the capital is available for development, the capitalist or their government will soon provide the facilities for training more skilled people. The real bottleneck is expansion. The real bottlenecks to expansion are therefore capital and natural resources, and we can proceed on the assumption that that so long as these are available, the necessary skills will be provided as well, though perhaps with some time lag. If unlimited labor is available while capital is scarce, we know from the law of variable proportions that the capital should not be spread thinly over all the labor. Only so much labor should be used with capital as will reduce the marginal productivity of labor to zero. In practice, however, labor is not available at a zero wage. Capital will therefore be applied only up to the point where the marginal productivity of labor equals the current wage. This is illustrated in Figure 1. This is the horizontal axis measures the quantity of labor, and the vertical axis its marginal product. There is a fixed amount of capital. OW is the current wage. If the marginal product of labor were zero outside the capitalist sector, OR ought to be employed, but it will pay to employ only OM in the capitalist sector. WNP is the capitalist surplus. OWPM goes in wages to workers in the capitalist sector, while workers outside this sector, i.e. beyond M, earn what they can in the subsistence sector of the economy. The analysis requires further elaboration. In the first place, after what we have said earlier on about some employers in these economies keeping retainers, it may seem strange to be arguing now that labor will be employed up to the point where the wage equals the marginal productivity. Nevertheless, this is probably the right assumption to make when we are set upon analyzing the expansion of the capitalist sector of the economy. For the type of capitalist who brings about economic expansion is not the same as the type of employer who treats his employees like retainers. He is more commercially minded and more conscious of efficiency, cost, and profitability. Hence, if our interest is in an expanding capitalist sector, the assumption of profit maximization is probably a fair approximation to the truth. Next, we note the use of the terms capitalist sector and subsistence sector. The capitalist sector is that part of the economy which uses reproducible capital and pays capitalists for the use thereof. This coincides with Smith's definition of the productive workers, who are those who work with capital and whose product can therefore be sold at a price above their wages. We can think, if we like, of capitalists hiring out their capital to peasants, in which case there being, by definition, an unlimited number of peasants. Only some will get capital, and these will have to pay for its use a price which leaves them only subsistence earnings. More usually, however, the use of capital is controlled by capitalists who hire the services of labor. The capital analysis was therefore conducted on the assumption that capital was used for hiring people. It does not make any difference to the argument, and for convenience, we will follow this usage. The subsistence sector is by difference, or that part of the economy which is not using reproducible capital. Output per head is lower in this sector than in the capitalist sector because it is not fructified by capital. This is why it was called unproductive. The distinction between productive and unproductive had nothing to do with whether the work yielded utility, as some neoclassicists have scornfully but erroneously asserted. As more capital becomes available, more workers can be drawn into the capitalist from the subsistence sector, and their output per head rises as they move from the one sector to the other. Thirdly, we take account of the fact that the capitalist sector, like the subsistence sector, can also be subdivided. What we have is not one island of expansion capitalist employment surrounded by a vast sea of subsistence workers, but rather a number of such tiny islands. This is very typical of countries in their early stages of development. We find a few industries highly capitalized, such as mining or electric power, side by side with the most primitive techniques. A few high-class shops surrounded by masses of old-style traders. A few highly capitalized plantations surrounded by a sea of peasants. But we find the same contrasts also outside their economic life. There are one or two modern towns with the finest architecture, water supplies, communications, and the like, into which people drift from other towns and villages, which might almost belong to another planet. There is the same contrast between people, between the few highly westernized, trousered, natives educated in Western universities, speaking Western languages, and glorying in Beethoven, Mill, Marx, or Einstein, and the great mass of their countrymen who live in quite other worlds. Capital and new ideas are now not thinly diffused throughout the economy. They are highly concentrated at a number of points from which they spread outwards. Though the capitalized sector can be subdivided into islands, it remains a single sector because of the effect of competition in intending to equalize the earnings on capital. The competitive principle does not demand that the same amount of capital per person be employed on each island, or that average profit per unit of capital be the same, but only that the marginal profit be the same. Thus, even if marginal profits were the same all round, islands which yield diminishing returns may be more profitable than others. The earliest capitalists have cornered the vantage points. But in any case, marginal profits are not the same all round. In backward economies, knowledge is one of the scarcest goods. Capitalists have experience of certain types of investment, say of trading or plantation, agriculture, and not of other types, say of manufacturing, and they stick to what they know. So the economy is frequently lopsided in the sense that there is excessive investment in some parts and underinvestment in others. Also, financial institutions are more highly developed for some purposes than for others. Capital can be got cheaply for trade, but not for house building or for peasant agriculture, for instance. Even in a very highly developed economy, the tendency for capital to flow evenly through the economy is very weak. In a backward economy, it hardly exists. Inevitably, what one gets are very heavily developed patches of the economy, surrounded by economic darkness. Next, we must say something about the wage level. The wage which the expanding capitalist sector has to pay is determined by what people can earn outside that sector. The classical economists used to think of the wage as being determined by what is required for subsistence consumption, and this may be the right solution in some cases. However, in economies where the majority of the people are peasant farmers working on their own land, we have a more objective index. For the minimum at which labor can be had is now set by the average product of the farmer. Men will not leave the family farm to seek employment if the wage is worth less than they would be able to consume if they remained at home. This objective standard, alas, disappears again if the farmers have to pay rent, for their net earnings will then depend upon the amount of rent they have to pay, and in overpopulated countries, the rent will probably be adjusted so as to leave them just enough for a conventional level of subsistence. It is not, however, of great importance to the argument whether earnings in the subsistence sector are determined objectively by the level of peasant productivity or subjectively in terms of a conventional standard of living. Whatever the mechanism, the result is an unlimited supply of labor for which this is the minimum level of earnings. The fact that the wage level in the capitalist sector depends upon earnings in the subsistence sector is sometimes of immense political importance, since its effect is that capitalists have a direct interest in holding down the productivity of the subsistence workers. Thus, the owners of plantations have no interest in seeing knowledge of new techniques or new seeds conveyed to the peasants. And if they are influential in the government, they will not be found using their influence to expand the facilities for agricultural extension. They will not support proposals for land settlement and are often instead to be found engaged in turning the peasants off their lands. This is one of the worst features of imperialism. For instance, the imperialists invest capital and hire workers. It is to their advantage to keep wages low, and even in those cases where they do not actually go out of their way to impoverish the subsistence economy, they will at least very seldom be found doing anything to make it more productive. In actual fact, the record of every imperial power in Africa in modern times is one of impoverishing the subsistence economy, either by taking away the people's land, or by demanding forced labor in the capitalist sector, or by imposing taxes to drive people to work for capitalist employers. Compared with what they have spent on providing facilities for European agriculture or mining, their expenditure on the improvement of African agriculture has been negligible. The failure of imperialism to raise living standards is not wholly to the attributed to self-interest, but there are many places where it can be traced directly to the effects of having imperial capital invested in agriculture or in mining. Earnings in the subsistence sector set a floor to wages in the capitalist sector, but in practice, wages have to be higher than this. And there is usually a gap of 30% or more between capitalist wages and subsistence earnings. This gap may be explained in several ways. Part of the difference is illusory because of the higher cost of living in the capitalist sector. This may be due to the capitalist sector being concentrated in congested towns, so that rents and transport costs are higher. All the same, there is also usually a substantial difference in real wages. This may be required because of the psychological cost of transferring from the easygoing way of life of the subsistence sector to the more regimented and urbanized environment of the capitalist sector. Or it may be a recognition of the fact that even the unskilled worker is of more use to the capitalist sector after he has been there for some time than the raw recruit from the country. Or it may itself represent a difference in conventional standards, workers in the capitalist sector acquiring tastes and social prestige which have conventionally to be recognized by higher real wages. That this last may be the expansion is suggested by cases where the capitalist workers organize themselves into trade unions and strive to protect or increase their differential. But the differential exists even where there are no unions. The effect of this gap is shown diagrammatically in figure 2, which is drawn on the same basis as figure 1. OS now represent subsistence earnings, and OW, the capitalist wage, real, not money. To borrow an analogy from the sea, the frontier of the competition between capitalist and subsistence labor now appears not as a beach, but as a cliff. This phenomenon of a gap between the earnings of a competing suppliers is found even in the most advanced economies. Much of the difference between the earnings of different classes of the population, grades of skill, of education, of responsibility, or of prestige, can be described only in these terms. Neither is the phenomenon confined to labor. We know, of course, that two firms in a competitive market need not have the same average profits if one has some superiority to the other. We reflect this difference in rents and ask only that marginal rates of profit should be the same. We know also that marginal rates will not be the same if ignorance prevails. This point we have mentioned earlier. What is often puzzling in a competitive industry is to find a difference in marginal profits or marginal costs without ignorance, and yet without the more efficient firm driving its rivals out of business. It is as if the more efficient says, I could compete with you, but I won't, which is also what subsistence labor says when it does not transfer to capitalist employment unless real wages are substantially higher. The more efficient firm, instead of competing whatever its real costs are marginally less than its rivals, establishes for itself superior standards of remuneration. It pays its workers more and lavishes welfare services, scholarships, and pensions upon them. It demands a higher rate on its marginal investments, where its competitors would be satisfied with 10%, it demands 20% to keep up its average record. It goes in for prestige expenditure, contributing to the hospitals, universities, flood relief, and such. Its highest executives spend their time sitting on public committees and have to have deputies to do their work. When all this is taken into account, it is not all surprising to find a competitive equilibrium in which high-cost firms survive easily side by side with firms of much greater efficiency. So far, we have merely been setting the stage. Now, the play begins, for we can now begin to trace the process of economic expansion. The key to the process is the use which is made of the capitalist surplus. Insofar as this is reinvested in creating new capital, the capitalist sector expands, taking more people into capitalist employment. Out of the subsistence sector, the surplus is then larger still. Capital formation is still greater, and so the process continues until the labor surplus disappears. OS is, as before, average subsistence earnings, and OW, the capitalist wage. W and 1, Q1, represents the surplus in the initial stage. Since some of this is reinvested, the amount of fixed capital increases. Hence, the schedule of the marginal productivity of labor is now raised throughout to the level of N2Q2. Both the surplus and capitalist employment are now larger. Further reinvestment raises the schedule of marginal productivity of labor to N3Q3. And the process continues so long as there is surplus labor. Various comments are needed in elaboration. First, as to relationship between capital, technical progress, and productivity, in theory, it should be possible to distinguish between the growth of capital and the growth of technical knowledge. But in practice, it is neither possible nor necessary for this analysis. As a matter of statistical analysis, differentiating the effect of capital and of knowledge in any industry is straightforward. If the product is homogeneous through time, if the physical inputs are also unchanged in kind, and if the relative prices of the inputs have remained constant. But when we try to do it for any industry in practice, we usually find that the product has changed, the inputs have changed, and relative prices have changed, so that we get any number of indices of technical progress from the same data, according to the assumptions and the type of index number which we use. In any case, for the purpose of this analysis, it is unnecessary to distinguish between capital formation and the growth of knowledge within the capitalist sector. Growth of technical knowledge outside the capitalist sector would be fundamentally important, since it would raise the level of wages and so reduce the capitalist surplus. But inside the capitalist sector, would knowledge and capital work in the same direction to raise the surplus and to increase employment. They also work together. The application of new technical knowledge usually requires new investment, and whether the new knowledge is capital saving and thus equivalent to an increase in capital, or labor saving and thus equivalent to an increase in the marginal productivity of labor, makes no difference to our diagram. Capital and technical knowledge also work together in the sense that in economies where techniques are stagnant, savings are not so readily applied to increase productivity capital. In such economies, it is more usual to use savings for building pyramids, churches, and other such durable consumer goods. Accordingly, in this analysis, the growth of productivity capital and the growth of technical knowledge are treated as a single phenomenon, just as we earlier decided that we could treat the growth of the supply of skilled labor and the growth of capital as a single phenomenon in long-run analysis. Next, we must consider more closely the capitalist surplus.